Hello, students of Med 109. Let's get into the chapter on interpersonal communication. So inter is between and people, between people. So why is it important for MAs to understand interpersonal communication? Well, to recognize patient behavior and to better communicate and recognize patient issues. The communication circle. So there's only three. So it is just the source, the message, and the receiver. So don't worry about noise and feedback whenever you get a question on the communication circle. So the source of the message itself via verbal, written, or electronic, and then the receiver. Feedback, well, that is the response. It can also be verbal or non-verbal. And if it is just like a nod of the head, that would be a non-verbal cue. Noise, that's anything that disrupts the message. So it could be physical, like temperature, if the room is too hot or too cold, the patient's emotional state, or if they're under any anxiety, that would affect the communication circle. Different types of people, you'll need to communicate with them differently. So we'll talk about life stages and some cultural differences. Humanistic role. So nobody wants to feel like they're just a number. So the better you can communicate and recognize patients' needs, the better the healthcare experience will be. So that's what they mean by the humanistic role. Life stages. So from birth to 1 year, it's trust and mistrust. So when the infant cries, you pick up the child will feel needed, self-esteem. So that's how they build trust with their caregiver, primary caregiver, whether it's their parent or, in this case, healthcare worker. If you do not pick up the child quickly, then low self-esteem. They'll begin to not build that trust with their primary caregiver. Toddlers, autonomy versus shame and doubt. So these kids like to explore. Like if you have cabinets with pots and pans, they'll take everything out, put everything back in. So that's their autonomy. They like to explore. But if there is something they can't do, they would feel shameful for it. So if there's a task, or if it's like potty training a little bit too early, then they'll feel shame and doubt for that. Preschoolers, a little bit different. Instead of failing at something, they don't feel shame and doubt. Here they feel guilty. Right? School age, this is when they follow directions the best. So about 7 to 12, right before puberty, they're very industrious. If you have a kid this age that is diabetic, then they love games. So their goal is to keep their blood sugar at a reasonable level, and they'll stay on it. They're very industrious. If they can't do a task, they won't feel doubt, they won't feel shame. In this case, they will feel inferior. Adolescence. So we got the id, the ego, and the superego. So here they're discovering self, what it is to be themselves. However, if they hang out with kids with all purple hair, sooner or later they'll have purple hair. If all their friends have holes in their ears, then sooner or later they'll have holes in their ears as well. So you have that peer pressure that can come into play. They can't find their own identity. Young adults in their 20s. So this is where they should be finding love. So that's that intimacy versus, well, if they're not finding love, if they don't have roommates, then most likely they're living alone. So they're dealing with that finding love and isolation. 20s to 50s, here they're starting a family. So it's the family, raising the family up the generations, and stagnation. So kind of like that empty nest syndrome, when all of the children are out of the house, a lot of older adults will feel that their life isn't going anywhere. Older adults, integrity versus despair. So losing respect, maybe because of how the elderly are perceived, being senile, mentally slow, and then despair. With end of life, a lot of times there's depression and loneliness that sets in for older adults. So if you take a look at general life stages, you can kind of predict what things are going on in their life, what kind of needs uh, that they're battling or needs that they're deficient in. Okay, that brings us to Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. So here in the pyramid, as long as you have your base level covered, then you're able to move up this pyramid. So the first level are your philosophical needs, then safety, then belonging, esteem, and then self-actuation. So in the next slides, I'll describe each of those steps. So physiological need. So this is food, shelter, water, temperature regulation, basic life-sustaining needs. Safety. So do you have shelter, safe environment? And then people are tribal. We want to feel that we belong to a group. My team versus your team. So once we have those needs covered, then belonging, then patient will have esteem. So that's respect from the society. And ultimately what we want to achieve is self-actuation. So that is the person being themselves, who they are meant to be. So a lot of times people will act out when some or one of these needs are not met. And a lot of times they'll manifest itself into some kind of anxiety. And how they deal with the anxiety is the basis of their behavioral issues. So always consider the patient needs, whether it's based on life stages or cultural differences. And then adjust. You're going to be in contact with many different patient populations. Positive versus negative. So overall, I'll outline some positive and negative communication types. Communication can also be verbal and nonverbal. Actually, they say about 80% of our communication in person is about 80% nonverbal. So body language plays an important role. Positive verbal communication. So yes, it promotes comfort and well-being. It makes the patient want to open up. You ask open-ended questions. You're not judging the patient. No bias. Right? But now with negative verbal communication, you might be mumbling, being rude, short with the patient, not making eye contact. So pretty much the opposite of positive verbal communication. Body language. So very important that you display some genuineness in your facial expression. So a genuine smile. Eye contact, depending on the cultural acceptance. Some cultures, it's not good to have prolonged eye contact. Some cultures, you don't make eye contact with those that are older than you. So, based on the cultural differences. Turn towards the patient, so your posture. So here she's positioned a little more towards the patient. And then keep an open body. So arms aren't crossed, and then nothing in front of you. So you have an open posture. Touch. Touch is nonverbal. So since nonverbal can be misinterpreted, it's very important that if you touch a patient, and some touch is appropriate, on the shoulder, the forearm, back of the hand, that's perfectly fine. But you may explain to them why you're patting them on the shoulder. If it's like a small child and you're giving them a hug, right? Explain to them why you're giving them a hug. Give me a hug because I'm proud you went through your treatment. That way it's not misinterpreted. Personal space. So the first zone, 12 to 5 feet. So that is like the public zone. And then the inner zone, so about 5 feet to 1 feet, that's more of the personal space. Again, depending on the culture, sometimes if you're not face to face with the person, then they don't feel respected when you're communicating. So if you step back and the patient step forward, that's probably a cultural thing. Good listening skills. Interpersonal skills, so between people. And then assertiveness versus aggressiveness. Passive listening, this is usually one way, where it's just a message going one way, not too much, maybe um, acknowledgement of understanding here or there. Active listening, now we have two-way communication where there is feedback and continued communication cycles. Prepare to listen. So position. Put the chairs close to the patient. Turn towards the patient. If need be, have your notebook, pens, and questions ready to go for the patient. Do a little rehearsal. Maintain appropriate amount of eye contact, so length of eye contact, maybe no more than 5 seconds at a time. And respect the patient's personal space. Be warm and friendliness. So sympathy versus empathy. So sympathy is, well, you're feeling sorry for the patient. Nobody wants sympathy. Nobody wants anybody else to feel sorry for them. But empathy is identifying. I identify with your feelings. I identify with your situation. Even though I may not have been in that situation, I understand and recognize your feelings. That's empathy. Nobody wants sympathy. And then respect the person. Don't group them, generalize them. Treat them as an individual. Fake. So a lot of times when you're going through like the register at a retail store, the clerk will have the same prompts. Hello, how are you? Thanks for coming. Come again. All right, so you want to make sure that your communication with the patient doesn't seem that mechanical and it's actually genuine. No fake smiles. Have openness, so be available for the patient. Assertiveness versus being aggressive. So when you're assertive, you know who you are. You have confidence, you have understanding, and there's a lot of respect. So to get something done, be open, honest, and direct. That's being assertive with the patient. The opposite of that is aggressive. So when you're not sure of yourself, when you're timid, unconfident, and you need stuff to get done, you might come across bossy to get it done, or quarrelsome, or you don't care about people's feelings or needs. You'll manipulate them to get the job done. So be assertive in your directions. Good communication skills. So being silent is therapeutic because it allows the patient time to think. So give them, at least 5 seconds. Pause, maybe even longer, so they actually will think. And that's a very powerful trick to get people to open up. Just be silent. Accepting, that means we're taking in what they're saying, right? We're not agreeing with what they're saying. We're just saying, we're just taking in that information. Giving recognition, so understanding what they're saying. Offering self, making yourself available to the patient. So time. So healthcare professionals, super busy, but make sure you feel that the patient's time is valuable. Your guys' time together is valuable. Giving broad opening, so open-ended question, and this allows the patient to lead. For example, what brings you in today? What do you want to talk about? So what are the progress from last time? Things like that. That way it lets the patient lead. Offering general leads. Again, this is open-ended. You want to avoid any yes or no questions to get the dialogue started and continuing. Make observations. So this is verbalizing what you see to the patient. That way they can kind of recognize what other people's views are. And vice versa, what you can do is have the patient communicate their observation. So what you make observation and what the patient communicate, do they equate? So a lot of times that's very therapeutic. My observations and your observations don't match. Mirroring, so repeating what the patient's saying and reflecting, very similar. A lot of times a patient will ask you your opinions, and the best thing is to redirect it to what do you think you should do if they ever ask you what you should do or what you would do. If a patient goes off topic, just redirect them. Get them back on topic by focusing them. Ask questions to explore, meaning giving them the opportunity to give more information only if they want to. But if they start feeling or they start looking like they're uncomfortable, then you want to stop. Right? So only explore up to the patient's comfort level. Clarifying, asking questions to make sure their point came across correctly. And then at the end, you kind of want to summarize, especially if you have an interview session with the patient. You don't want to leave them abruptly, like, hey, our time's up, and just leave. You want to make sure you kind of bring things all back together. Ineffective. So these ones are going to be bad. Reassuring. Well, we don't know if things are going to be okay or not. So we can't tell the patient that, hey, their choice is the best choice. Everything's going to be okay. Giving approval or disapproval. So these will go hand in hand. And the reason you don't want to give approval or disapproval is patients will then tend to seek your approval. So if you have choice A over B, they might look at you and you give approval to choice A. So then they're going to go with choice A. Or if there's a choice C and D and you didn't like C, then of course they're going to go with choice D. So you don't want to bias the patient's choices by approving or disapproving. Agreeing or disagreeing. Well, if you agree with the patient, then you're letting them know that, well, they are right. And if you're disagreeing with the patient, then you are the antagonist. So you don't want to build a relationship of being against the patient. Advising, most likely not an MA task. We don't advise the patient what to do, so it's out of the scope of a medical assistant. Exploring versus probing. So remember, exploring is therapeutic. But once the patient becomes guarded and don't want to talk about a topic and you continue on, that is probing. So you cross the line of exploring. Defending, right? So giving reasons or explanation. So why is never a therapeutic question. So they can explain, but you don't ever want to ask why. Right? Minimize feeling. So if the patient feels scared before they go into surgery, you can't just say, oh, you'll be all right. There's nothing to be scared about. You want to make sure you acknowledge feelings that the patient are having. Stereotypes are usually negative things associated with the group. So avoid any of those stereotypical comments because usually it's a negative connotation. Defense mechanism. So to prevent dealing with a situation, patients will come up with a lot of things. So change. Adaptive is change. So in order to deal with the situation, they can become adaptive, able to change with the times. Or so here's a couple defense mechanism. Compensation. So this is the classic case. If a guy is really short, then to compensate for that, he gets a big old truck or a sports car to compensate for being short. Denial. So basically, you pretend the issue doesn't exist. Displacement. Well, you can't really directly focus your energy on the thing that's causing the problem, so you focus on something else that you can. So it's like the boss takes it out on the worker, who goes home, takes it on the husband or wife, and they take it out on the kid, and the kid kicks the dog, so everyone is just passing the buck down. Disassociation, so you're separating the issue from its cause. We'll go through some of the other ones. Projection. This is putting your beliefs or your feelings onto somebody else. So you project your attitudes, your feelings onto another person or group. Rationalization. So coming up with a story to make sense for your choices. Regression. So there's 3 steps. So regression is going back to a previous state or condition. So regression, the first step of regression is protest. Then there is despair. And then lastly, denial. So for example, when the mother drops off the kid the first time at school, the kid cries, throws a tantrum. And then after the kid realizes the mother isn't coming back for a while, they'll sulk, despair. They'll sulk in the room for a while, and then eventually they'll come around, start playing with the kids. But when it's time to pick up the kid, and mother comes, mother calls for the kid, and now the kid doesn't come to mom. So what's going on is, well, the child got hurt and doesn't want to come back to mom because it doesn't want to open themselves to being hurt again. So the mother feels really bad, think that they destroyed their relationship with their child, but it's just regression. So temporary regression, perfectly fine, but if they're going multiple steps back, then that could be a big issue. Repression, kind of like denial, but you're like pushing down or pushing away any bad thoughts, memories, or experiences. Special circumstances. So language barrier, disabilities are the main ones. Heightened emotions, mostly anxiety. You'll have to be able to identify mild, moderate to severe. So the difference is the types of directions you can get. So if they have mild anxiety, so that's if they're just staring at things, focusing. Young kids will do this a lot when you come into the room first. They'll stare at you, look at things. So with mild anxiety, you can give directions, and they'll be okay. Moderate anxiety, you might want to just give them two choices instead of directions. And then if it's severe anxiety, you just want to calm them down before you continue your communication. Cultural differences, especially how different cultures take on healthcare. In some cultures, just a little tiny scratch, they want to get it treated because it might lead to something else, or it might be the sign of something bigger. So any little bump, bruise, scrape, they'll go in, get it checked out. In other cultures, it's the exact opposite. Little tiny nicks, bumps, and scrapes, they never go in for because it's just to them little bumps and scrapes before, or and they don't come in until it's too late, till they have something where it's really severe. Parent disability. So anybody dealing with Medicare, Medicaid patients, they'll need to have an interpreter. So if it is someone who can't speak or see sign language, and for other cultures, just an interpreter. So the first thing in dealing with anxious patient is identifying that level of anxiety. And once you identify that, you'll be able to tailor your directions. So look for signs. So mild, just prolonged focus. If they start to sweat, get clammy, heart rate's increasing, then that's going to be more of the moderate to severe anxiety symptoms. You can say things like, I noticed you look a little apprehensive. Do you want to take some time to relax before we continue on with the procedure? Angry patient. So identify the reason. So were they mistreated by you or felt they were mistreated? Was it a treatment they didn't want or an outcome they didn't want? So identify it, and of course, do not take it personal. You're the person that's there in the room, so you're going to be the person that takes a blunt of their abuse. Goal? Well, refocus the patient, solving the problem. Why are you angry? Well, okay. Let's go ahead and focus on your treatment. We mentioned some unique beliefs like small injuries. Some believe can lead to others. Others believe it's just nothing. Avoid stereotyping. So stereotype are usually negative attributes that are given to a group. Right? And the reason you don't want to use it is it's negative attributes that you're giving to an entire group. Generalization is very similar. It doesn't necessarily mean it's anything negative or positive about a group, but what you're doing here is you're not recognizing the individuals. You're just shoving them in and not paying any attention to who they are as an individual and their own differences. Mention one cultural difference when communicating was the personal space. For some cultures, if you're not nose hair to nose hair with them, then that's not communication. Other cultures, you gotta maintain that 4 to 6 feet distance. Patients with limited reading skills. Most literature we give to patients will have anywhere from a 4th to 8th grade reading level. And even acceptance of Western medicine is different in other cultures. So in some African societies, they reject Western medicine. They believe more in their superstition-based treatments. Mentally or emotionally disturbed. So anxiety here, maybe injury or drugs, and or low IQ. So just determine what they can understand and tailor your communication to that level. Sometimes pictures will help, gestures, and repeating it in simple English. Don't raise your voice, and then try to remain calm. The patient will reflect your behavior, your responses. Terminally ill patients. So any patient in hospice or end-of-life care. Respect their rights. A lot of patients will have death anxiety, and you want to maintain their dignity and comfort during hospice treatment. Stages of dying. So the 5 stages. The first one is denial. This is not happening to me. So they don't accept it. They don't believe that they're having cancer, AIDS, and they're dying. Next is anger. So they might throw a tantrum, have fits. Why is it happening to me? Next, they're starting to accept it. So there's bargaining. So for example is hopefully I can live until graduation for my nephew or something like that. So they're starting to negotiate. Next is depression. They'll fall into a deep sadness. And then finally, acceptance. Identifying which stage your terminally ill patient is in will allow you to better meet their needs. Family and friends. Well, sometimes you might get every member of the family and a few friends calling in, checking on the well-being of their family member. And it's very important that when this happens, you don't want all your time answering these questions from friends and family, that you designate one representative. And then that representative will be the person you communicate with. So hopefully that saves your time and it prevents anybody from having any fights with friends and families. So remember, you do have to protect confidentiality. So maintain HIPAA, HIPAA standards. HIV positive and AIDS, well, the stigma used to be very negative. Used to be life-threatening as well. Nowadays, with the proper treatment, you can live a long, healthy life. And the negative stigma of diseases like HIV has actually decreased. Have accurate information about the risks. So you can't contract it by shaking hands or giving somebody with HIV a hug. And then the same thing, treat every patient with dignity. Coworkers. Rapport, that's your relationship with your coworkers. So is it open, honest, positive? Right? We don't want it to be negative, closed communication. Follow your chain of command. Many places, nurse, charge nurse, the head nurse, there's usually open communication. But in any case, make sure you follow your chain of command. Management. They may have an office, they may not. Their time is very occupied, busy, important. So just give them updates as needed. Ask questions, but a lot of times ask them if it's a good time. Try to schedule meetings and interruptions around their main tasks. Conflict resolution. So if you have an open, anybody's able to call out anybody, atmosphere, everyone's accountable, then usually there's not a lot of conflict. It's when you have closed communication, a lot of things brewing, that's when you get a lot of conflict. So I recommend having a very open communication in your work culture. So don't feed into it. Don't enter into gossiping, any negative stereotypes, and jump into conclusion. Because usually there's more than one side to a story. Boundaries, physical, psychological. So a lot of times when patients get better and they leave like the hospital, they want to stay in contact. So you got to remember we have loss in life. So we already talked about physical barrier, like giving someone a hug, a patient a hug, a child patient a hug. Make sure you verbally communicate with them why they're giving the hug, because nonverbal communication can be misinterpreted. So I cannot touch you, you cannot touch me. Psychological, keeping in touch after they leave. So we're going to have to teach the patient to deal with loss. So in life, right, we're going to lose people. When a patient leaves after prolonged treatment, yeah, it's going to suck not seeing them, not communicating with them, but we're teaching them how to deal with loss in the future. Limit undesirable behavior, definitely, patient, and then take action. Okay, so that ends interpersonal communication. Our next chapter is going to be telephone skills. I'm just going to overview that one real quickly.